It all started as a gathering in small circles by like minds. In no time, it gathered momentum. The internet assisted in promoting the cause. In no time, too, it became a nationwide protest, and the Republic of Kenya was never going to be the same again. So much was going to happen in just a matter of days. The parliament building was going to be attacked. Other public institutions were not going to be spared. Day in, day out, and for many days, the protesters poured into the streets, and their major demand was the suspension of the finance bill and the resignation of the President William Ruto. In response to the situation, President William Ruto gave in to the demand and quickly suspended the bill, and in about 2 weeks, the president sacked almost his entire cabinet. In this edition of Back in History, we present to you the story of the Gen Z protests in Kenya, which started in June 2024 and spread over to the next month. Welcome to this edition of Back in History. The genesis of the protest was the passage of the finance bill into law by the Kenyan parliament. The finance bill was an executive bill having emanated from the presidency. It had the full support of the president. But for the people of Kenya, the citizens, were already going through so much, and the introduction of a bill that meant that citizens were to pay more taxes was unacceptable to the people. The question here is, what exactly were the provisions of the finance bill that sparked the protest in Kenya? And here is the answer. The bill had a number of provisions, principal of which were: 1. It introduced what it called eco-levy on all imported products said to be harmful to the environment, such as sanitary towels, diapers, motorcycles, tires, plastic packaging, electronic devices, audio-visual recording equipment, radio equipment, and general electronic equipment. 2. The bill made an amendment to the Data Protection Act and made it possible for the Kenya Revenue Authority (KRA) to gain access to the bank and mobile money statements of account of Kenyan citizens. Before now, such agency of government could only access bank statements upon due authorization by a court of law of competent jurisdiction. The amendments to the Data Protection Act implied that the KRA can, on their own, gain access to the accounts of citizens for purpose of taxation on such accounts. 3. The bill introduced a 2.5% vehicle tax with a minimum of 5,000 Kenyan shillings and a maximum of 100,000 Kenyan shillings. This was later amended to remove the maximum amount. 4. The bill introduced a minimum top-up tax of 15% on resident individuals or entities with a permanent presence in Kenya affiliated with multinational groups earning over 750 million euros annually in at least 2 of the previous 4 years preceding the first year of income. 5. The bill also introduced a withholding tax on payment made for goods supplied to public entities at 3% for residents and 5% for non-residents. 6. The bill introduced road maintenance levy from 18 Kenyan shillings to 25 Kenyan shillings per litre of fuel. The implication of this was that the price of petrol per litre was going to increase, with the resultant effect being the increase in the prices of commodities in the market. 7. The bill introduced a withholding tax on interest from infrastructure bonds with a maturity of at least 3 years at the rate of 5% for residents and 15% for non-residents. 8. The bill introduced a withholding tax of 5% for residents and 15% for non-residents on any sale in shops hosted by any digital marketplace. The digital marketplace would be required to withhold the required amount and remit to the government of the Republic of Kenya, with consequences in the event of failure. 9. The bill introduced tax on bread. 10. The bill introduced tax on transportation of sugarcane from farms to milling factories. 11. It also introduced tax on locally assembled mobile phones, electric bikes, solar and lithium-ion batteries, and electric buses from tax exempt to standards, which would introduce a 16% VAT on the items. 12. Tax on alcoholic beverages, cigarette and tobacco-based products were to be increased to 40% and higher for more potent alcoholic beverages. 13. The bill also introduced 25% excise duty on vegetable and seed oils and 5% duty or 27,000 Kenyan shillings per ton on coal, whichever is higher. 14. The bill also increased excise duty on 20% for financial services transactions, telephones and internet services, lottery, betting, gaming, and advertisements on the internet and on social media. As can be seen from the aforementioned, the bill indeed made far-reaching provisions, and in summary, the people of Kenya, the foreigners resident in Kenya, and other persons having one business transaction or the other to carry out in Kenya was bound to pay a lot more in taxation to the government of the Republic of Kenya. The new tax regime, according to the government, was to assist in mopping up revenue to address the deficit in the budget and to take care of other needs of government. But this did not go down well with the populace, especially the youth population of Kenyans, known popularly as the Gen Z generation. They were not going to allow the bill to see the light of the day. They were appalled by the provisions of the law. They complained bitterly that the implication of the law simply meant that the cost of living in Kenya was to go up exponentially. They vowed to resist the law, and in no time, they matched their words with action. On 24th day of June 2024, yours truly took off from the Murtala Mohammed International Airport in Lagos on board Kenyan Airways and landed in Nairobi, Kenya the following morning with intent to connect from Nairobi to Kigali in Rwanda. The flight from Nairobi to Kigali was delayed for about 6 hours, and yours truly engaged the services of a taximan to take him through the streets of Nairobi before returning to catch the flight to Kigali. This was on the 25th day of June 2024. We drove for about 10 minutes and began to see people in clusters. The taxi driver, himself a Kenyan citizen, informed me that we needed to go back to the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport as quickly as possible. He told me that from what he could perceive, a protest was in the air and that it was just a matter of minutes for it to commence. As a foreigner, I had no reason to argue with a citizen who obviously knew his country more than me. We then made a detour to the airport. From the airport, one could see the protest across the city of Nairobi. In no time, it became violent, with smoke billowing from public places that had been burnt. We could also hear gunshots. The parliament building had been touched. The police and other security agents opened live ammunition on the protesting youths, and scores were killed in the process. The internet exploded with scenes of violence in Kenya. Major news channels like the CNN, Al Jazeera, Sky News, the BBC, and others carried the story of the protest that turned violent in Kenya. The whole world was rudely alerted of the near breakdown of law and order in Kenya. The protesters were not prepared to back down. All was not well with Kenya, and the reason for the unrest was the finance bill. On this first day of the protest, the 25th day of June 2024, it was reported that not less than 19 people were shot dead in Nairobi. 3 other persons were also killed in other cities in Kenya. In a swift reaction to the situation, internet services were jammed ostensibly on the orders of government. This did not quell the situation. If anything, it increased the protest. On the said 25th day of June 2024, following the spate of violence on the streets of Nairobi, Secretary General of the United Nations Antonio Guterres made a statement urging Kenya's police and security officers to, quote, exercise restraints, stating that he was, quote, deeply concerned over the violence the world had seen. On its part, the United States called for calm, and 13 other nations of the world, including Canada, Germany, and Britain, expressed shock at what was going on in Kenya. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken reportedly spoke with President Ruto to call for restraints. On its part also, the Kenya Conference of Catholic Bishops condemned the killing of protesters in the country and called for an immediate end to the killings. The protesters gained tremendous support from within and outside Kenya. The economic freedom fighters in South Africa, led by Julius Malema, made a statement standing with the protesters. The economic freedom fighters of South Africa in its statement said, quote, "We stand in solidarity with the people of Kenya who are bravely protesting against the exploitative legislation that seeks to impose severe tax." End of quote. Ugandan opposition leader and activist Bobby Wine voiced his support for the protesters via X. He encouraged the protesters thus, quote, "Power to you, the young people of Kenya. You are speaking up and your voices are being heard far beyond the Kenyan borders. We hope your leaders too are listening. We continue to stand in solidarity with you. Viva." End of quote. Many other international celebrities also gave their support to the protesters. They shared posters of demonstrations and other banners across the internet. The Azimio Coalition Party, led by Minority Leader Opiyo Wandayi, stated that it had unanimously rejected the Finance Bill 2024 in its entirety. It requested that its members at the parliament who submitted amendments to the bill should withdraw them immediately. Gideon Moi, Kenyan politician and party leader of the Kenyan African National Union, condemned the arrest and abduction of people perceived to be leaders of the protest. He stated that an attempt to suppress the voices of those who bear the brunt of overtaxation, unresponsive economic policies, and lack of accountability on the part of the government through unlawful tactics is unacceptable. End of quote. Law officers, human rights defenders, and other international organizations added their voices of scores of citizens were akin to pouring more and more fuel into an already volatile situation. Hell was literally let loose, and the coming days were both scary and pregnant. Something needed to be done as quickly as possible. In reaction to these developments, President Ruto addressed the nation and suspended the finance bill with immediate effect. In the same breath, he ordered a 346 billion Kenyan shillings budget cut. These budget cuts affected national and county governments, including the executive, legislature, judiciary, and constitutional commissions. The National Treasury was directed to prepare supplementary estimates to reflect these deductions and restrict spending to essential services. President Ruto emphasized that these measures were necessary to compensate for the revenue shortfall from the rejected finance bill. He described the protest as an action carried out by criminals and stated that his government will crack down on them. His speech did not assuage the protesters. The protest continued. Hundreds of protesters carried the casket of Benson Kamau, who was one of the protesters killed during the storming of Parliament, and protested against his murder on the streets of Nairobi. President Ruto called for dialogue, but the protesters rejected the president's appeals for dialogue as their demands had escalated, including calls for his resignation. They announced fresh protest dates scheduled for July 2nd to occupy Nairobi's Central Business District, sharing their plans on social media under the hashtag OccupyCBD Tuesday. On July 2, clashes broke out in Nairobi between the police and the protesters demanding Ruto's resignation. The protesters barricaded Waiyaki Way, the main road through Nairobi center, and threw stones at police in the central business district while police used tear gas on them. The protesters seemed to have found a solution to the effect of the tear gas. They remained undaunted and kept protesting and moving seriously towards the policemen. Protests also occurred in Mombasa, Kisumu, Nakuru, and Nyeri. On July 5, President Ruto addressed protesters on X at a forum hosted by influencer Osama Otero. He apologized for Otero's abduction by police during the protest, as well as, quote, the arrogance and show of opulence by legislators and ministers from his party. He also pledged to act against, quote, rogue police officers who fired at unarmed civilians during the protest. Ruto announced significant austerity measures following the protest. He eliminated budget provisions for the first and second ladies' offices and also reduced government renovation budgets by 50%. He dissolved 47 state corporations, halted the firing of chief administrative secretaries, and mandated the retirement of civil servants aged 60 and above. By taking these measures, President Ruto aimed to assuage the protesters and restore peace to the nation and his government. At every public appearance, President Ruto could be seen as someone physically and emotionally distressed by the situation. He appeared highly exhausted. All was not well with him and his government. On July 7, in a state briefing, President Ruto dissolved almost his entire cabinet, with the exception of Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua and Prime Cabinet Secretary and concurrent Foreign Minister Musalia Mudavadi. This was the most drastic decision to be taken by President Ruto in his bid to bring the protest to a halt and retain his seat as President of the Republic of Kenya. On 12 July, student protesters blocked a major highway in protest over the discovery of the remains of a protester who was killed and dumped in a quarry outside Nairobi. The protesters said that he was killed by police after posting a video of himself participating in the storming of the Kenyan parliament. On the same 12 July 2024, Japhet Kome Nchebere resigned as Inspector General of Police. He was replaced immediately by his deputy, Douglas Kanja. The story of the protest against the Kenya Finance Bill of June and July 2024 shall remain in the history books of Kenya, Africa, and the world for many more years to come. Thanks for watching this edition of Back in History, and do remember to subscribe to this channel or follow the page for regular notification on every new video. I remain your friend and host Ekeme Udim, wishing you the best of time as you continue to accompany me on this journey for the documentation and preservation of the history of Africa.